Hi, guys. My name is Logan Brade. I'm a developer advocate here at Ionic, and welcome to my presentation on hybrid or native, choosing the right app development strategy. Um, Before we jump in, though, I'm actually going to have Diana do something really quick. If you could throw up that first poll. For you guys who are listening in, I wanted to ask, what stage of the mobile app development process are you in? Are you just starting? Are you trying to figure out your strategy? Are you mid-development, maybe trying to figure out like a newer strategy? Or are you just finished and you're here to just learn more information about the mobile app development strategy process? Just go ahead and work on that poll. I'm going to continue on and we'll check back on those results shortly. So also before we get started, audience participation is totally acceptable and encouraged. So for me, I don't know about you guys, I really enjoy like having a conversation about this. And I don't like being talked at. So essentially, during webinars, if like if you're sitting in a webinar, somebody's talking at you, it doesn't really promote engagement. I want to try to create content and like try to answer your guys' questions. So be sure like throughout this webinar that like you ask questions, I'll be like monitoring the chat and the Q&A and going through it. And also I would like to ask you two more questions before we get started. What would you like to learn from this webinar? And then are there any specific questions that you are looking to get answered? When it comes to mobile app development strategy, there's a lot of caveats and pitfalls. So the more that I can gear this towards you guys and make it like around your use cases, I feel like the more that you'll get out of it. And as you're kind of going through and filling that out in the Q&A and talking in the chat, I'm going to go ahead and start introducing myself and we'll check back on this slide shortly. Here we go. So this is an objective presentation of my subjective experience. There isn't a one-size-fits-all solution. And what I mean from that is that when you're trying to choose your strategy, and just based off of my experience with trying to figure out the strategy, every use case is going to be different. So I'm going to try to cover as many of the use cases I can based off of my experiences working in this realm and like try to share as much as I can with you. But like I said, be sure to like ask questions. I'll do my best to answer them. And the very worst case scenario, if I can't answer your question, I will do my best to try to find somebody who can actually answer your question here at Ionic. So a little bit about myself, personal drivers. I basically have always kind of straddled the line between business and technology. I've held both roles in technology, and it's kind of like where I like to be. So just some business roles that I've held. I've been a business analyst for a major airline. I've been a project manager for major airline and hospitality companies. As far as, and I've also been a solutions architect in the pharmaceutical space. So like actually working with business customers to define strategy and technical architecture. As far as technology roles go, I've held a wide variety of technology roles, sometimes in parallel with some of the business roles. So I started off my career as a DevOps engineer, working in big systems for Fortune 500 companies. And I've worked my way all the way up to being like a director of information technology and application development, actually defining mobile app development strategies for teams. And so from just like my business experience and my technical experience, I've learned a lot about the ways to manage projects and develop strategies. But I've learned a lot too that the business and technology teams see strategy differently. And so through that, it gets me thinking, like, why do we choose hybrid versus native development strategy? Hybrid or native strategy is defined differently for businesses compared to engineering teams. And honestly, both sides kind of misunderstand each other. So when I was actually going through and like developing these strategies, I figured out that both areas of the business saw it differently. And so I wanted to try to recompile this list to help you define your own strategies and help make your journey through choosing a strategy more effective than just trying to analyze it from a business perspective or technology perspective, but actually allow you to kind of pick other important factors that'll work across the board, whether you're like trying to help and like aid businesses or aid the technology side. And just kind of a side note, like one of the things I noticed just throughout my career and like working on engineering teams is that a lot of times, we always get caught up in the details of like, what does technical architecture look like? What does performance look like for the tech that we're choosing? And I often find that like the technology teams get overridden by business teams on much more practical matters than that. So, as much as we want to look at it from an engineering perspective, and we want to like obviously have good technical architecture and like make sure that we're choosing performant technology, it's also being able to evaluate like important business factors as we're trying to define the strategy. So to cycle back, and before I kind of go through my story about mobile app dev and like how I determine strategy and like the things that I've learned through my career, let's cycle back to our first slide here. What stage of the app development process are you in? Let's see if I can bring up the poll here. Oh, here we go. Okay, so about 23% of people are just planning, developing a strategy. Wow, 31% are mid-development, 13% are finished, and then 33% are just here to grow their knowledge. And I appreciate that. So that's good to know that like most people are here to just learn more about strategy and how to define it. That's cool. So let's see, did anybody answer the questions? What would you like to learn from this webinar? And are there any specific questions you're looking to get answered? Okay, I don't see anything, so I'm going to go ahead and continue, but just keep these questions in the back of your mind. And if you happen to like come up with something, just throw it in the chat, throw it in the Q&A, and Diana will also let me know if I miss anything. So my mobile application development story. So before I started working at Ionic, I was an director of application development for like a major company that basically worked. It was a property management company, and it was an international property management company. Because of the space that we worked in, the technology was fairly antiquated. So when I came on board, I was like their first software engineering hire. And I was basically tasked to go through an entire digital transformation process for them. Over the next 3 years, we ended up basically taking their 20-year-old LAMP stack and migrating it to a full microservices architecture. So we utilize things like AWS, Node.js, serverless tools like SES, SNS through AWS Cloud, and basically transformed the entire organization and created like actual integration points with the company, and also created new web apps so that the businesses that we served as a property management company could essentially like work with our customers, work with their customers, and like essentially just went through a whole process of like transforming the business. This process was fairly successful, and this digital transformation proved useful for the business. But of course, with success kind of comes the scary aspect of like, okay, what's the next step? So the company that I worked for basically decided that we needed to hit a B2C market. So the transformation was essentially like, hey, we need to actually communicate with these customers, and we need to find better ways to like get our information out to them. And we really need to be more customer centric so that the businesses that we help can essentially like communicate with the customers. So we were challenged as a team with a mobile app for 2 different parts of our business to reach out to those customers. So the challenge, this is what we were challenged to do. We had to create 5 applications across 2 different business units. So my company actually had a sister company, and through that, they realized like, hey, there's really 2 opportunities to reach out through customers, and we're going to do that through mobile apps and one web app. So we had 2 Android applications that needed to be developed. We needed 2 iOS applications that needed to be developed. There was 1 progressive web app that needed to be developed as a part of like the sister business unit. And that was like an actual B2C web application, but like essentially businesses were the ones who were using that web application. We had a $250,000 budget. And I'm sure some of you who are looking at this right now are kind of like, oh, $250,000 budget for 5 applications it's a little insane, but I'll definitely get into it. And we essentially had 1 year to get to an MVP, and that was for all 5 applications. So to skip ahead, this was kind of the outcome of what we got to. So we ended up choosing a full native implementation. So working for Ionic, I'm sure you guys are like, wow, you chose a full native implementation. Full native implementation. It took us 2 years to actually get to an MVP. We had to split our development team. And we ended up hitting a budget of about $500,000. So I'm sure some of you are looking at it, and I'm going to ask you this question. Would you consider this project successful based on like the challenges and the outcome? In my mind, I wouldn't consider this project successful when we went with the full native implementation. We were over time. We essentially thought it would take us a year, but obviously as you go through the app development process, you learn that like customers want different things and it's constantly changing. You're constantly going through revisions, especially if you're trying to just start and get into like native mobile applications and like get stuff into the app stores. There's a lot of trial and error that happens. We were over budget. We weren't able to hit any of our defined goals. And I think a lot of that had to do with expanding requirements and like changing requirements. But, us as an app dev team struggled trying to get that over the finish line. Over resources. We ended up having to bring in extra help to help get us over the finish line to meet that 2 years. And so it caused a lot of problems. And, while that's not unusual for shifting requirements and expectations, and I was really proud of my app dev team for what they were able to accomplish, I realized that like me as a director of applications development, my strategy failed. It was not where it needed to be. And there was a lot of things that I learned during that process that contributed to our app dev strategy that I would change now and maybe not do a native implementation. But I wanted to share that with you guys, what I think are important factors for when you're trying to define your strategy. So the key factors that I learned from this whole crazy experience was team composition, requirements, costs, ongoing maintenance, and future state. Some of these are going to be more technical and some of these are more business focused, as you can tell, but these are kind of the things that I felt like I missed during that process that were critical to our app dev strategy that I don't feel like we're being talked about enough from not only the technical teams, but the business teams during that process. And actually, before I continue, I think we have a question. My company is an OutSystems powerhouse. I'm curious on the practicalities to move to Ionic for the front end part of the particular demanding B2C projects. Any pointers on how to do this sanely would be awesome. So that's a question for Miguel. I don't know if you can elaborate, but let me see if I can. Any pointers on how to do this sanely? Practicalities. I don't know if you can, would you be able to give us more details about the front end of this project? Because that might actually define what we do and like how we'll cover it. I'm going to go ahead and continue, but definitely feel free to write more information about that. And I'll be sure to answer your question. So team composition. So during this mobile app development process, our strategy essentially was to split our app dev team. And this was a critical error when we were going through the process. So we were a team of web developers. And as you can see from the slide, we had 5 developers, particularly 4 were more front end, can kind of jump into the back end. So a little bit full stack developers. And then we had 1 full on back end developer who was working in AWS and Node.js technologies. And we ended up saying like, okay, who wants to work on Android? Who wants to work on iOS? And like, we're going to keep our back end guy working on back end technologies. So we ended up splitting. We had 2 developers go to Android. We had 2 developers go to iOS. And then we had 1 backend developer who stayed there. And there was a couple reasons for this. So when we were going through and gathering requirements, there was some critical requirements as a part of the project that we felt like couldn't be done in a hybrid situation. And I'll definitely touch on that a little bit more in the requirements section, but that had a lot to do with why we went to native technologies. The other aspect of it was that the engineering team was really excited to learn about native technologies. And so we were under the impression like our excitement for the tech would counteract maybe some of the pitfalls of not having enough people to work on individual parts of the application. And that was true to a point. So for the first couple of months, we sailed along and we were basically beating our deadlines. We were doing really, really well. But as the months drug on and we were kind of going through, our web developers still had other web development projects that they had to work on in conjunction with these mobile applications. So all it really particularly did was we ended up slowing down significantly after that excitement had ended. So the problems, right? By splitting our app dev team, we ended up having decreased output. The output was great from the beginning, but as time went on, we realized that like when there were challenges, there was new feature updates, there was bugs, we had a new prioritization problem with our team because like we had to essentially say like, well, do you want this mobile app dev stuff done? We're hitting a deadline with Apple or Google. They're coming out with their new tech. So we got to try to do that instead of our web development stuff. Or this web development feature, like it had a bug. We have to go back and we have to fix it. So we can't address the things that we need to do with mobile app. Essentially, it just created a lot of problems for us to prioritize the work. Prioritization problems. So essentially, like when we had to turn around and tell the business that, you know, what do you want us to work on? We largely got everything is important, right? Because both of the applications that we were servicing service different customers. We had our B2B customers who were paying for contracts for us to manage their properties. And then on the customer side, these are the people who are actually going to those properties and using their services. So these were the people who were spending money. So it's like that caused a real issue where we were just overloaded and essentially had to work on a crazy amount of issues that just it shouldn't have happened. The other problem was less experience. So a lot of the team that we had, the web dev team, had been working in web dev technologies for a number of years for a number of organizations, right? Including our like senior team lead. And like a lot of the people on the team had been doing it for a number of years. So they were really skilled in web tech. The problem was that when we all switched to native technologies, it level set all of us. So when junior developers like would come to the more senior people to get more information, it created a lot of headaches because the senior developers didn't actually know how to address certain issues in the native web tech because we were all learning together. And so that significantly slowed down the amount of work that we were able to produce. And honestly, a lot of questions started coming back and that we would have to sit down and discuss. So it really slowed us down from a time perspective. And then, of course, there's trial and error issues. When you're working with native technologies and you're coming from a web dev background, things don't work the same. So when they don't work the same, you have to figure out how they work in iOS and in Android. And quite frankly, depending on the tech that you're using, they can work fundamentally differently from the web. So what did I learn from this? Considerations for strategy, right? Experience. When you're looking at your team, in my case, we had all web developers. You know, if we didn't have this one important feature that the business said was going to be like vitally important to the creation of this app, like it doesn't make sense to go through and have your web development teams go through a whole different like learning experience with native technologies, right? Like you should respect the experience that they've gained and understand that like if you try to go through this process and you're just starting from scratch, that can create a lot of problems. Team size. So the difference between hybrid and native, specifically in our use case, was that we had to split our team. So instead of going through the process, like we just didn't have enough people to be able to get through. Like we would do, you know, probably a few, probably like 100 to 200 user stories in any given sprint. And that slowed us down to about like 20 or 30 for each one. Let's see. And then the ratio, right? How many native developers do you have and how many hybrid developers do you have or just web developers? And being able to understand that like if you have a team that is largely comprised of web developers, you know, it makes sense to go with an actual hybrid strategy. Now, if you have a team, a large team, and they happen to be mobile focused, well, then it makes more sense to go with like an actual mobile native strategy. Another thing to consider, learning speed, right? So when you put your teams through that, there's a ramp up time. It doesn't matter how amazing your dev team is and how quickly they can learn. That ramp up time can still be anywhere from like 2 to 4 weeks just to be a competent developer. But then also it could be several months before they really become experts in the technology. So is there any questions? See Miguel. Oh, Miguel followed up. This was more to state what moved me in particular to attend the webinar. As we start learning, what are the gains of going to Ionic in general? It may not really be a question answerable in the context of this webinar. Oh, okay. So the good thing is, like, with Ionic is that you're given a lot of tools, right? Like if you're trying to transition from OutSystems tools to Ionic, you have the ability to go as in depth as you want to go. So like if you want to go full development, you want to code up a whole bunch of stuff, you have the power to do that. But you also have the power to not get in the weeds if you don't want to, right? Like we have Ionic Framework to help you with design. We have Capacitor that allows you to like touch native code without having to touch native code if you don't want to. And we have a lot of tools to help make that easier through plugins. I think we have like 300 supported plugins. So there's like a lot of things that can help make that transition easier as you're trying to do the front end development. And of course, it's cross-platform. So I don't know. Is there any other questions? I think that's it. Okay, I'm gonna go ahead and continue. Requirements. Okay, so the requirements for this particular project that we were challenged with, there were 70 screens that were designed. The screens, I mean, fairly basic screens, right? Login, profile, there was some company content, there was a rewards tracking portion, and there was even a little bit of e-commerce that was incorporated into that. The two challenges that we came across, and this is why we actually chose a native strategy to begin with, was real-time mapping and video streaming technology. So the company was trying to, as a part of their strategy, transform themselves to be more of like a lifestyle brand. And as a part of that lifestyle brand, video was going to be a huge component of that to help people like buy into the idea of the properties that we were managing, because it was mostly hospitality. So a lot of travel stuff, golf, restaurants, that type of thing. And that really geared us towards being like, hey, can a hybrid strategy actually support these two things? And at the time, we thought the answer was no. And that was a critical error, right? Like we did not research enough to understand that like that was an error. So the problems that we encountered with this, with our requirements and going with a full native strategy, and something that you should look at, is that our requirements doubled. So not only are you developing for iOS, you're developing for Android. So our 70 screens, I think we ended up having like 140 user stories as we were going through this. It ended up being over 280. And that was across essentially two developers were working on 140 user stories, which is honestly, that's unmanageable. And we thought that like, as we were going through the process, because we kind of did design after we got some of the requirements. And when we actually got the full set of requirements, we realized that this was not going to be a sustainable model. So we had to continue on and like actually make it work, but it was hugely problematic as we were going through the development process. The other factor was going with the full native strategy is that it complicated our requirements. So the video portion, I think, is a good example, right? Like we had to use HLS, which HLS is an Apple like native technology. It works really well in iOS. But the problem is that when you're trying to get it to work for Android, there's certain steps that you have to take that don't exist for iOS. And when you're trying to get it to work in iOS, the video players in iOS only work in a certain way. And you have to develop it in a different way than what you would for Android. So not only do we have to actually do the R&D and figure out the backend architecture and how the video was going to play, but then we also had to figure out how does it work in Android? How does it work in iOS? They're different, and that would break things. And so it would create inconsistent user experiences across the board. The other problem we came into was look and feel issues. Android and iOS look different, and our customers immediately noticed when we tried to our screens were mainly created to look like iOS look and feel. But when you try to put that into Android and code it, it doesn't work the same way because of the positioning of buttons, the way the users use it. So we had to go through, as we were developing screens, redesign them so that they would work for Android. It wasn't a cross-platform process. We had to create our own designs that would fit those platforms specifically. And the other part was just incorrect assumptions. And I kind of addressed it. We thought that we couldn't do a lot of stuff with hybrid technologies. And that was just not the case. So what I learned from this and the considerations of strategy in terms of requirements, number of requirements. Like if you know that you're going to have a lot of requirements in the project and you have a smaller team, understand that like in native like strategies, you're going to have to at least double your requirements at the bare minimum. And quite frankly, I think when we were going through the process, we realized it wasn't even going to be double. It was probably closer to like 250% more requirements, maybe even like 300% requirements, just because we would have to do everything twice. And then there was the problems associated with each of those requirements. Another thing to think about if you're trying to choose between hybrid and native technologies, platform-specific requirements. So I kind of talked about HLS and video, but another thing to consider, like, is the app you're developing, is it going to be like solely a Reality Kit app? Well, Reality Kit we know is specific to iOS. So if you're going to do something that's specific to iOS and you don't really need to branch into Android or even have like a hybrid experience, then you could probably go with a native strategy and just develop it using like a native mobile strategy. Is it going to be like an app clip? Because if it is, then you don't really need to do that. Or is it something gaming related? Like hybrid technologies do have like awesome gaming libraries, and like specifically with Phaser for Phaser and Ionic works really well for game development, but are you doing something that's hyper specific in your game that requires like specific iOS or Android libraries, or even like Unity or like one of those other design frameworks? That's something to consider. And if you're doing something that's hyper specific, it makes sense to do more of a native mobile strategy. Another part to consider when you're looking at your requirements is plugin coverage. So through Capacitor, there's a lot of stuff that's covered in hybrid development, right? So you could do, like we have plugins for camera, we have plugins for local notifications, we have plugins for like push notifications, for store stuff. Like we have a plugin for everything. And even like stuff that's created by the communities are really, really good. It can help you develop your app. But with that being said, if you're going through and you're realizing like, hey, a lot of the stuff that I need to do for my mobile app isn't actually covered by, a plugin, and I'm going to have to do like, I don't know, the majority of my app has to be custom plugins, then it probably doesn't make sense to take on a hybrid strategy. That would make sense to take on a native strategy. But with that being said, hybrid covers a huge use case. Like 90% of your use cases will be covered, probably even more than that now with the use of community plugins. But it's something to consider, like going through the documentation, seeing like, are my use cases covered? If they're not, then it kind of makes sense to do more of a native strategy versus a hybrid strategy. Any questions about that? Foldables and large screens. So Dwayne asks, when will Ionic Framework add UI components that better support foldables and large screens? It seems to be designed only for iPhones. To be honest with you, Dwayne, I have no idea. So I will find out. I don't know if there's stuff that we can release on the topic, but I will be sure to get an answer to you. But it will most likely be, I don't know, or we don't have anything planned as of yet. Let's see. Oh, we have some more. 7 years ago, I had the same issue with 3 platforms and 5 different devs. We also didn't execute the app at time. Oh, yeah. Well, I'm glad there's a little bit of commiserating happening here. There's definitely, I feel like as devs, we kind of go through this experience where we're constantly trying to fight resources. Like we're given too much and we just don't have enough time to do it. So it's always about prioritization, trying to get out as much as we can. But I'm sorry you have to go through that experience. Lots to think about with accessibility considerations too between hybrid and native. Yes, you do. But the good part is that when you're actually doing hybrid development, it does help, like from a standpoint of you don't have to create your accessibility things in 2 different places. You can do it once and it should be able to help. And if you do have to create something that's specific to the platform, there's options to use like custom plugins to do that, and it shouldn't be a huge undertaking. You wouldn't have to create like a number of custom plugins. Oh, another question. Ernst Olivier Are single page web apps being built as native or hybrid in general? For example, a basic video streaming app experience. I think when it comes to the app stores, and maybe Diana could correct me if I'm wrong on this, I remember hearing about like 15% of apps in the app stores are actually hybrid applications. So it could be more or less than that. I think most things like video streaming apps are done in native technologies. But a caveat to that, I actually have a blog post on ionic.io/blog. I'm sure we'll send out an email that actually has the exact link, but I actually created a cross-platform streaming application. And there's a tutorial on how to do it so that you don't have to go through and create it on the individual like platforms. It's actually a cross-platform video streaming web application. Oh, Cecilia chimed in 15% in Google Play and 10% in Apple App Store. And that was from last year, and that's specific to Ionic and capacitor. So that might not even include the full hybrid stack. So to kind of clue you guys in beforehand, like there was Cordova before, so that doesn't include Cordova applications. Okay, so I'm gonna have to continue because we're running out of time and I got a lot more to cover. Here we go. So the next area was costs, right? So through the app dev project, we had a limited budget. And honestly, we didn't have a ton of wiggle room. It was, I want to say like for R&D, I think we had about 50,000 for R&D through that. But we were mostly constrained to that 250. So when we exceeded it, there was a lot of conversations about why did you exceed it? What happened? Our costs, the original plan was to actually hire developers for native development. We were going to bring them on a contract basis. And then as the app was done and grew, we were going to bring them on full time. And we did have one good aspect of this is that infrastructure costs were being covered by cloud provider. In this case, AWS covered a lot of our infrastructure costs. So that also played into our strategy of going native because that took about like $50,000 to $100,000 off our total costs. The problem, native development just costs more, right? Essentially, your developers, if they're creating a login screen, they have to do it twice. And often it's at a higher rate than what it would be for web developers. We lost pretty much our entire R&D budget just due to ramp up time. We had 4 developers that essentially had to learn those skills to be able to develop native applications. And so that took about, 4 weeks of time to just get through some courses and to be competent enough to say like, yeah, I can do this. Native developers are more expensive to hire. At the time when I was going through the process and looking at it, this was, mind you, probably about like 2017 timeframe. So costs have changed a lot. Things have gotten more expensive. But at the time, we could hire a web developer for somewhere between like $80 to $90 an hour in my area. I'm in Phoenix, Arizona, so it's a little bit cheaper than probably some of the tech cities. But native developers at the time were going for, at minimum, $150 an hour. And I'm sure as of today, it's more expensive than that. But that skill set of being a native mobile developer is more expensive. And quite frankly, R&D is just more costly. You have to do it twice because of the differences between the platforms. Considerations for strategy. Are you limited on budget? And I know that like obviously everybody's limited by some budget, but when we were going through this process, we were kind of planning it out, we realized that a hybrid application would probably cost about $150,000 to $200,000. Native applications could be anywhere from like when we priced it out and we went to different competitors to actually potentially build it out, they were talking anywhere from $300,000 to $400,000. So like, does your company have wiggle room to allow potentially $100,000 difference, in their budget if you're trying to hit that? So if you're limited and you don't really have a ton of wiggle room, it doesn't really make sense to go with the native strategy if you have to learn the technology. If you already have developers who are competent and understand and want to work in like iOS and Android stuff, then you might not be as like have to worry about the limited budget. But just generally speaking, as you're looking at your strategy for your upcoming project, got a limited budget, hybrid can help you get to market a lot faster and a lot cheaper. Resources. Are you going to have to bring on more people, or are you good with the team that you have? In our case, we were under the assumption that we were going to bring on people. That just didn't happen. So, we kind of had this whole idea of what our resources were look like, and we didn't really base it off of our existing team. And if I could go back and change that, I would. I would look at it based off of our existing team, and we didn't have the resources at the time to manage a full native project. So if you are going to take the same approach and you don't have native developers on staff, a hybrid option is a really good way to go. Or if your company's willing to make the investment on getting those resources and you're actively going to go through that process, then you might be able to do a full native strategy. I think another aspect is length of investment, right? Is this application going to be something that's around in just for a year, for 6 months, or is this a full-on strategy that you're going to be in for 10 years? If this is a long-term play, sometimes it makes more sense to do a full native strategy, because of the way that the technology works. That's not to say you shouldn't use a hybrid strategy if it's going to be a long-term thing. But, if you know that you're going to grow it into something that needs to be a full native mobile application, then sometimes it makes sense to start off that way and grow into it. Are there any questions? Let's see. Intoli asks, if I have a question about capacitor plugins, what is the best way to ask them and find answers? So we have a Discord that has a little AI tool that can help you find out about specific plugins that kind of goes through our documentation. And of course, the Ionic capacitor documentation. I'll be sure to send out a link in an email for all of those details. How about a point of view around no greenfield implementation, but migrating native code bases into hybrid models to consolidate? Do you have a point of view there? I do, actually. So Ionic has developed a really nifty tool if you're trying to shift from a full native implementation into a hybrid model. The technology that they created, something called portals. So portals essentially allows native projects to implement hybrid technologies into different screens. It's part of a full-on micro front-end strategy. It's really in-depth. I'm sure there's definitely going to be talks on that, so stay tuned. And there's a ton of stuff on that. But yes, portals can really help you on the other side if you have a full native strategy and you're trying to go into a hybrid strategy. Oh, thanks, Diana, for sharing that. And Cecilia. All right, so we're going to go ahead and keep moving forward. So another thing to consider was future state, and something that I messed up on. So, oh, did I? Sorry, I think I skipped ahead here. Yeah, I did. Sorry, this is future state. So essentially our future state or ongoing maintenance, I think is where we're at. Hold on, costs. I apologize, I messed up on my slides here. Anyways, so one of our strategies that we kind of went up and we were going off of the assumption on was our updates were going to essentially mirror web projects, existing web projects. We were going to have 0 changes to the testing strategy, and that was a mistake. And I'll tell you why. And then we were also going to dedicate resources to maintenance. So those people I was talking about that we would hire on that were native developers, they were going to be part of our ongoing maintenance strategy. So the problem, mobile app update cycles are different. They're not going to follow your web strategies. And quite frankly, Apple and Google have their own ideas of when you should be updating your mobile applications. And so it's never going to, I don't know anyone who's been able to get them to line up correctly. And it honestly just creates more headaches when you're trying to manage both setups. Testing strategy is fundamentally different, and it requires specific skills. So there's a whole set of, with our web stuff, we had a ton of automated tests that would go through, test out the applications. And for mobile, we weren't using actual automated test suites. We had to do everything manually, and we also used manual beta testing for our users, which wasn't a part of our web strategy. So when we were trying to release things, that created problems. And of course, our dedicated resources never came. So considerations for your strategy, update cycle. If you don't have the resources to dedicate to 2 different update cycles, then hybrid might be the way to go, because you can still dedicate your web resources to the mobile project without having to go fully onto a native like mobile web project. Testing strategy. I kind of touched on this a little bit. Automated testing, right? Like there's ways to do it, but they're expensive and they're specific to the platform. So if you don't want to have to learn like a new testing strategy, native might not make sense to you. But if you have the resources to dedicate to specific mobile app dev testing, then native could be a great option for you. And of course, resources. Like if you're not going to have the resources, then it's not worth it. Any quick questions about that? Any issues with app review process for Ionic apps? So with the app review process, specifically with Apple, it's extremely challenging. On average, it could take 2 to 4 weeks to just get your app approved once you're ready to go into the App Store. And I have one particular horror story where it actually took over 8 months to get an application into the App Store. It had something to do with Apple News and just their review cycles for it. But it's really any application that you're releasing into an app store is difficult and it's time consuming, but we do have tools to help with that deployment process, specifically app flow. So that's one thing to check out that will help with your app deployment process to make it as smooth as possible. Okay, future state. So the future state of our applications, mobile applications were going to be a long-term strategy. We were all in, or supposedly I thought we were all in. And of course, our customer demographics were changing. The company that I worked for, our average demographic was white male over the age of 55. And we realized that our customers were starting to change. We were starting to get younger people in, more diverse people in. And so we realized that mobile apps were going to be a way to reach out to that new customer demographic. The problem is that our growth wasn't what we were expecting. We thought we were going all in and we just didn't have the adoption that we thought was going to happen. And that was based on a number of features. We polled people and they turned around and were like, yeah, we want mobile apps. We want mobile apps. But the actual usage and adoption of it just wasn't there. And unfortunately, our future state changed after that development. We really took a step back after things happened because we realized it wasn't working when we went with the full native strategy. So some considerations. Is this a prototype that you're developing or is this a long-term strategy? And this kind of goes to the length of investment. But if you're looking to get an application out there within 6 months, it's a proof of concept. You just want to see if it's marketable and if you can make money off of it to then like do a full investment. Hybrid is a really good way to go because you don't have to develop it twice, right? If it's a long-term strategy and you know it's something that you're going to really as a company invest time, money, and resources in, then a native strategy could really work for you. Is your application revenue generating or is it just an exposure application? The reality is, and when I was going through this process, is that mobile applications are not particularly revenue generating for most people. I think it's like the top 10% of apps are the ones that make money off of this. And the reality is that like, if this is just something to get your business name out there, your idea out there, just to get eyes on it, to go back to a different model for your business, investing in native applications is an expensive way to do it. Another question to ask yourself, will the application need to be native someday? So this kind of goes back to the requirements aspect of it. Like, did you do all of your requirements gathering, realize that there's a hyper-specific requirement or group of requirements that can only be done in native, but you've pushed that off? Is that pushing of it off? Is it going to be like 5 years? Is it going to be 10 years before you implement those features? Or is it going to be like 6 months to a year? So when you're making the consideration, if those features need to be up front sooner, in front of your customers sooner, then it might make sense to do more of a native strategy than a hybrid strategy. So I know I'm running out of time. I'm going to skip questions on this one, but we'll come back. And actually, that is it. So are there any questions? How is WebView and native working through Ionic? So it does use a web view, but we have something called, so we have a tool called Capacitor. That's what allows things to go across platform. And that there's an aspect to Capacitor called the capacitor bridge, and that actually communicates with the device directly, depending on the features that you're trying to interface with. So like when you're working with the camera, you're working with push notifications or like device specific features, it's that capacitor bridge that's interacting through the web view to do it.
Awesome. Yeah, if you do have any questions, now is the time. Feel free to throw those into the chat or the Q&A. And I think one just popped up there for you, Logan.
Would you recommend hybrid for apps that communicate with connected devices, fitness trackers, wearables, Bluetooth speakers? So that depends. And I hate to say that it depends because I feel like that's the answer to anything app dev related. But is that going to be the huge portion of the app, or is that going to be a small function of the app? So I think how much of the requirements does it take up will largely determine if you go native or hybrid. And also like based off of the team requirements, can your team support it? In my view, if the whole thing is just a fitness tracking, like you have to work with like other technologies, then it might make sense to actually go more native in that case if you're connecting like via Bluetooth and things like that. But another point is that hybrid applications, because of things like custom plugins, if it's a small feature of the app, then you can actually create a custom plugin without having to do full development in a native sense. So it kind of depends on what direction it is and how much of the app it takes up. Another one. I think for me, the uncertainty about whether a hybrid strategy will be able to cover all the functionality that businesses will think of in the future is my main concern. So this is something that I ran into when I was going through it. So before we picked a full native strategy, we were actually on path to use Ionic and Cordova. And so we as a team learned Ionic and Cordova, but then we hit that one issue with the requirements and we're like, oh no, we need to implement a full native strategy in order to make this work. Right. But I think that was an incorrect assumption. So, and kind of going back to the plugins, if your use case is covered by all plugins, specifically like supported plugins and community plugins, then like you're going to be covered in 90 to 95% of the use cases with hybrid applications, right? It really comes into play when like the majority of what you're being asked is something that has to have a custom plugin developed with it. If all of your requirements are hitting custom plugin territory, then it might not make sense to do it all custom plugins because you have to interface with like Xcode and like Android Studio directly to do those custom plugins. And then you're in those applications anyways. And it just kind of creates a layer of abstraction that just makes things more time consuming. We face a lot of issues maintaining camera preview plugin. Right now, we are struggling on using SDK version 33. Can you suggest best plugin for the camera? I cannot, but I will research it. And I don't know if I can get your information, but I can definitely figure it out for you and ask the right people. Because there's a lot of people on our team who mess around with camera plugins and will know the answer to that are smarter than I. So I think that's it. Is there any more questions, comments, concerns, emotional outbursts?
Okay, well, people are still jotting down any notes or any questions. I'll go ahead and get to some ending slides here, but first and foremost, thank you so much, Logan, and thank you everybody for tuning in to our webinar today. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen just really quickly for some ending slides, some information that I want to share with the group. So if you don't mind stopping your share, please, Logan.
Yes, yes. Sorry about that.
Oh, no, you're fine. And like I said, we still have time for questions, everybody. So if you do have some questions, we're here to chat with you. We're here to stick around, so don't be shy. But let me just go ahead and share my screen here really quickly. So for those of you, if you're not checking out your screen, please do. I just popped up a huge QR code there for you. We value your feedback so much. We want to hear from you. We want to know what topics you're interested in learning about. You know, we're well into 2023 and, you know, getting closer to the end of the year. So we want to hear what topics you're interested in learning about, how we can help you with choosing, you know, the correct app development strategy for you and your teams. So whatever feedback you have for us, please just take a quick second to go ahead and scan that QR code and let us know. Give us feedback on, webinars that you've really been enjoying from us or topics that you'd really like to see. Because believe it or not, we definitely check out each and every survey submission, and we definitely do read all of the feedback. So thank you so much in advance for anybody who participates in that. So I'll just leave that up there for a quick second. I see some folks there saying, great presentation, Logan,
Oh,
and
thank
thank
you.
you. Thanks so much, everybody, for tuning in. Okay, well, like I said, if you haven't checked out your screens, please do. There's a QR code there. And like I said, we really do check out the feedback. So we'll make sure to review your submission if you submit one.
Yeah, and we really do look at that. And of course, like across all of our socials too, when you have questions and stuff, we often create content around the stuff that you guys post and ask us. So like these questions that I don't know the answer to, somebody's going to be creating content around it. I promise. Like that's our goal. So definitely check
Yeah.
that out. Talk to us, reach out to us, and we'll be creating content around it.
Absolutely. Shout out to Cecilia again for dropping in that Discord link. We have a very active Discord channel. So if you're not already a part of it, go ahead and click that link. If you're not familiar with Logan, you can definitely see a lot of him on our YouTube channel at Ionic Framework. He does so many live streams for us. I mean, can't you tell his setup is pretty stellar? So you'll definitely be able to see him on YouTube and hopefully some upcoming webinars as well. But if you're not already subscribed to that, our webinar content is actually also uploaded on our YouTube channel along with several past presentations, product demos, and more. So I definitely recommend subscribing to our YouTube channel if you're not already subscribed. Another call out I wanted to do is for an upcoming event. For anybody that is potentially actually attending the Forrester Technology and Innovation Conference in Austin coming up, we will be there. So we are sponsors of this event. You'll definitely see us there September 10th through the 12th at booth number 317. So if you have a chance to attend the event, we'll be there and we'll be more than ready to chat with you about all things Ionic, all things super apps. We have a super apps dedicated case study session. It's a 30-minute case study session that we'll be having on that Tuesday. So if you happen to be in Austin and you happen to be coming to the Forrester Technology and Innovation event, we'll be there at booth number 317. Alrighty, well, with that, I just want to say thank you, everybody. We're going to wrap up here. Like Logan mentioned, if you want to reach out to him, reach out to Ionic. Actually, I think you have a slide here,
I
Logan.
do. I do have a slide, so I will share it. Pull it up
Perfect.
here.
Speaking of that,
Actually, I will play it. So projects and socials, YouTube, like Diana said, at Ionic. You can totally find me there. I also have my own stuff on YouTube called Game Engineer Labs. That's mostly like 3D printing content, recently animatronic stuff, side projects. So I often interface with Ionic for things. So that'll be on there. Twitter, Logan Brade, LinkedIn, Logan Brade. TikTok is Game Engineer Labs, which is going to be Ionic, other tech focused. And then of course the Ionic blog.
perfect. And I want to call out this comment because I think it's so nice. We have someone saying thank you in the chat, and they mention knowledge gained.
Oh,
So
nice.
I mean that's a pretty awesome call out, Logan. Knowledge gained. That's what we're hoping for. That's what we want to hear. If you do have any other feedback, the post-event survey will be available in our recap email, along with the recording and some awesome additional resources to blogs that Logan will be linking out for you. So the recording will be available later on today. But thank you so much for joining us, everybody. Definitely tune into another webinar coming up in September. We're working on that for you right now. So keep an eye out for those promotional emails, the promos on our social media channels, and we'll see you again here very soon. Thanks
Bye.
again,
Thank you.
Logan.
Oh, thank you. Bye, guys.